Okay, it's 6:32. It's my pleasure to introduce the president of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, Jeff Hulstrong, who is going to kick off the program tonight. Jeff?
Thanks, Tom. Good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us. As Tom mentioned, I'm Jeff Hulstrong. I'm the president of the Green Mountain Audubon Society. We're a chapter of the National Audubon Society covering Franklin, Grand Isle, and Chittenden counties in Vermont. If you receive this magazine and you live in one of those three counties, you're a member of Green Mountain Audubon Society, and thank you. If you're interested in joining, I'll paste a link to our website, which will enable you to get more information and join the chapter if it looks good to you. Tonight, Doug Morin will be presenting on the habitat and wildlife of Vermont, which has been sacred to Indigenous people for thousands of years. The Western Abenaki are the traditional caretakers of these lands and waters. We respect their connection to this region and remember the hardships that they continue to endure. We give thanks for the opportunity to share this place and to work to protect it. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our Master of Ceremonies, Tom Gimicello, my fellow board member.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So it is my pleasure tonight to present for you this program and to introduce Doug Morin, who is currently the bird project leader at the Fish and Wildlife Department. He works out of the St. Johnsbury office, and he has had notable successes along with the department with the restoration of falcons and bald eagles and osprey. But one of the reasons we wanted to have him talk to you is the changing climate and land use pattern, and get an update and see what is going on right now with the department in their programs and monitoring for birds such as the whipperweel or the chimney swifts, Bicknell's thrush, and Goldenwing warblers. So since 2013, he has been working for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he has a master's from the University of Vermont. I liked his last sentence. He said, most days he can be found in front of his computer, but his favorite days involve spotting scopes and canoes. So given that, Doug, take it away.
Thanks very much, Tom and Jeff. And thank you all for having me. So I'm going to chat. I'll be a talking head in front of you for in the ballpark of half an hour, 45 minutes. And Tom, I think, is going to be monitoring the chat. So if folks have clarifying questions as I go, if something really doesn't make sense, then feel free to try to throw something in there and Tom can wave me down. Otherwise, we'll have a couple points during the talk where we can answer any questions, pop back in the slides, be a little less formal as we go. So as Tom mentioned, my title is the Bird Project Leader for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. We have a couple other staff that also deal with birds. We have a waterfowl specialist, and we have someone that deals with upland game birds, so grouse and woodcock. And basically, if it's not one of those groups, then I deal with all the other ones. So what I like to do to kick things off, if I can get my slide to advance here, is to ask people to reflect on what you know or what you think you know about what the Fish and Wildlife Department does. So this is perhaps my very favorite slide in the entire presentation, the pizza eating Bigfoot, of course. The Fish and Wildlife Department is often implicated in various wildlife cover-ups, such as mountain lions and Bigfoots. And when we're not doing that, we have a whole other set of responsibilities related to the entirety of the wildlife and plants in the state of Vermont. So fairly all-encompassing. We have 13 species that are currently state listed for birds. And a timely update is, I anticipate within the next week or two, it'll become official that bald eagle will be removed from the state endangered species list, and eastern meadowlark will be added, along with a number of other changes that are happening with insects and a few other taxa. So we have about 13 species. These species get a higher level of legal protection than our standard species, although all of our native birds are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So these are ones that we spend a little more time on than others. And we're going to start off by talking about some of the birds that are currently on this list, or a few that were recently on this list that have been removed. So these are some of the historical recovery projects that we have more experience with. So don't get overwhelmed by reading the numbers on the graph, but you can see there's basically two lines here. There's a red line that's going up and to the right. That's our nesting pairs of peregrine falcons. So we had falcons starting to nest in the 1980s, which was following a series of reintroductions of 93 birds that were brought to the state and reintroduced. And we had the first nesting that occurred naturally was at Mount Pisgah in Willoughby area in the Northeast Kingdom, if you're familiar with that. So we have a real steady increase in number of nesting pairs straight through until 2021. We haven't put that data in yet, but we're still going up. The blue line is fledglings per nesting pair. So we'll see this number quite a few times. And this is a way for us to gauge how well this particular species is doing. In particular, if you imagine how many chicks each pair is producing, that's a good gauge of, is there a lot of competition? Do they have a lot of resources? Do they have few resources? So for peregrine falcons, we're seeing kind of a gentle decline over time, which is about what we would think. As they're saturating the habitat, they're basically occupying, the majority of the natural cliffs that would be suitable for them. We're starting to see a slow decline. The population's not growing as quickly as it once was. So that's all consistent with what we'd expect. And you can see a map here. These are the 2020 sites, but they're largely the same year to year. The outcome changes sometimes. You can see peregrine falcons pretty evenly dispersed over the state. And they were endangered until, I believe it was 2005. They were removed from the endangered species list in the state. So there's a success story that we've had recently, and most notably, Audubon has been a substantial partner of ours in coordinating this and dealing with volunteer nest monitoring and posting signs. There's a lot that goes into trying to keep the nest cliffs free from disruption. So another species, common loon, we have a similar looking graph. We've got increase in time in that red bar of our nesting pairs, relatively stable, maybe a little bit of decrease in that blue bar of our productivity, our number of chicks per nesting pair. So you can see loons, we're topping 100 nesting pairs a year now, which is pretty crazy. And again, with a slight decline in that bar, and just what we know about the size of lakes, the classifications of lakes and ponds that loons like, we're guessing that loons are pretty much saturating their habitat. We're seeing the new sites that they're occupying are, a little less ideal for loons. They're either smaller or they might not have the characteristics that an ideal loon habitat would look for. In the case of your area of interest for the Green Mountain Audubon Society, we get the question, a fair amount, that why aren't there loons nesting on Lake Champlain? And I suspect one of the limiting factors there is going to be the high level of fluctuating water in the lake, because loons are so dependent on consistent water level. And in fact, that's one of the activities the department deals with commonly, in this case, through the Vermont Center of Eco Studies. They have a staff person who just does loons full time in the summer, and dealing with water levels on hydro-controlled lakes and ponds. So we have agreements with those facilities. We deal closely with them so they can't reduce or increase the water too much, which would strand or drown a loon nest. So another successful recovery story, they've been removed from the state endangered species list. And then we have bald eagles. Like I mentioned, the news will be official within the next couple of weeks that they'll be removed from our state endangered species list. You can see here the top graph with a green straight bar is the delisting threshold. So whenever a species goes on the endangered species list, it gets a recovery plan that says we're not going to remove it until we have X number of birds producing X number of young. In this case, I think it was 27 pairs within the recovery area, which includes pieces of the adjacent states. So we've been meeting that goal over a 5-year average since 2018. So the Endangered Species Committee and ANR said it's time we can take them off the list. Eagles will still maintain a higher level of protection through both the Migratory Bird Protection Act and the federal Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So they're pretty well covered at the federal level. And you can see a similar graph to the other ones with our red line pairs consistently increasing. We now have more than 50 nesting pairs, and our productivity, our chicks per pair, has gone up, and then it's kind of just leveled off. So not a lot of sign of decreasing yet, which is pretty fitting with what we think of eagles, is that there's probably quite a bit more room for them to expand over time. You can see here, this map is just a eBird snapshot from, I think it was 2021, basically during the nesting season. So these are not all active nests, but you can see a relative distribution of where we're seeing eagles. Considerable amount along Lake Champlain, lesser amounts in the Connecticut River Valley up near Memphremagog, which is basically what we'd expect around open water fish resources, and then periodically scavenging as well. And eagles were another product of reintroduction. There were 29 birds that were reintroduced in the early 2000s. And those are reintroduced into Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area down in Addison, many of you may be familiar with. And our first successful nesting was in 2008, coming after that. So, from 2008 to 2022, not very long to see significant population growth. And those to the rest of the region also, with some amount of active reintroduction, and then just really the populations took off naturally. And both falcons and eagles were significantly impacted by the use of the DDT pesticide, which was banned in the 1970s. So that really set up the stage for reintroduction efforts to be successful in this case. So once the birds came back, they were off and running. We have here, I know Mark Labar gave a presentation for you guys, I think, earlier this year about the common terns. So the common tern nesting islands in Lake Champlain. We have the same graphs, but you can see a very different signature here. So estimated pairs increased quite a bit through the 90s, kind of stable since then. And then our chick productivity in blue is just all over the map. So as biologists and managers, when we look at this kind of thing, we say, oh, wow, okay, something else is going on here. And we know this, both anecdotally and from all of Mark's good work out there, banding and assessing the success of nests, is the common terns just have good years and bad years, depending on predation, presence of gulls, that kind of thing. But that management is continuing, making sure people are not disturbing via signs, trying to keep the gulls off. You've heard Mark give all the details. But this is fairly typical also of what we're experiencing in the US and really in North America. Most of these sites now in the northeastern US and the Great Lakes are considered management dependent, which essentially means if we walked away, they would not do well. Continued management by people to reduce the predation, reduce the pressure of gulls, competing with them for that nesting site is considered to be essential to maintain those colonies. So there are some decisions we need to make around where we go with this in the future, but certainly a lot of effort has gone into this, and that's the reason that we've been able to produce some common terns successfully from these nesting islands. One neat fact about this is the islands in Champlain are the only inland island nesting population in New England. So all the other stay on the Atlantic coast. Our nearest neighbors with terns are up in Quebec along the St. Lawrence, and then they actually share more in common with the Great Lakes populations in that direction. So there's a brief survey of some of the past recovery efforts, some successful, some ongoing management with common terns. And after this little break for questions, we'll start talking a little bit more about future and other. But since it was near Valentine's Day, I thought this comic was appropriate. So if you have questions, I think you can drop them in the chat box and Tom will try to pass any on.
At this moment, we don't have any questions, but as Doug said, just type it into the chat box and it'll come to me and I will field your question and we will continue with our presentation.
Okay, great. So some of you may be familiar with this headline, 3 billion birds lost story. This was a study that came out in 2019. Many of the primary authors were at Cornell, but also a lot of collaborators. And the concept was comparing data from the 1970s to the 2000s and finding that not that we've lost individual species, but that we're losing individuals of each species. So instead of 100,000 robins, we only have 75,000 robins. We're losing abundance even of common species, which when we think about it is a significant problem for the ecological functions of these species. If we end up with only 2 of each bird on Noah's Ark, they're not doing their job in the ecology of the state. So this made a lot of ripples in the news community, which is a good thing to get the message out there. Digging into the analysis a little bit, you can see the table on the right. We have one group of birds sorted by habitat, the wetland birds, that have actually increased since the 1970s. So that's a great sign. And largely that's because we've been investing in that group of birds, which I'll talk about a little bit later. All the other groups of birds are showing declines, some within the level of margin of error, like coastal birds. But ones that are applicable to us, you can see eastern forests hanging around a negative 20% change. Forest generalists, same. Boreal forests dropping considerably farther, somewhere between 30 and 40% negative. And grassland birds, even more substantial, pushing 50% decline since 1970. So there are some caveats with this. You have to consider the baseline. If we say, well, what did it look like in 1970? Here in Vermont, we had more open land then due to farm activity. The succession of that open land has eliminated some of that grassland habitat. So we can see that as a decline. We can also say that's actually kind of a return towards a more natural state for the state of Vermont. So some of these things need to be weighed a little carefully, looking beyond the headlines. But certainly it's worth thinking about. And looking at our habitat in the state, we're about 75% forested with lesser areas of open grassland crops, primarily in the Champlain Valley, some in the Connecticut River Valley, as you're all familiar. And we can see in the case of this photo on the right, if you look at this one was aerial photo was taken in 1962, and I'll advance it. So this is the same location in 1974. Then we're going to advance it again. So keep looking at the patch of green, which is our forest cover, versus the patches of gray, which is open, developed land. So 1980, 1996. So there's 1962, 1974, 1980, 1996. So we can see the gradual fragmentation of these forest blocks. And we have mapping throughout the state showing where these forest blocks are, how they've been changing over time, but noting that we have an issue both with overall natural cover, so things like forests, shrublands, wetlands, and also the extent and the integrity of those units. If one is cut to pieces like Swiss cheese, then it's not going to function the same way as one that's in a nice big unit altogether. So development in Vermont has been proceeding at 3 times the rate of population growth. So we're building a lot faster than even our population is growing. And habitat loss is considered to be the primary driver of many of the trends we're seeing in many species of wildlife. Although I will note that migratory birds can be a little different than some other species, since some of these are long distance migrants, traveling many thousands of miles. They're encountering many different places over the course of their life cycle. Well, there's 2007. So that's our last one. So we'll add to that climate change. So here's the graph of various lakes that do ice out measurements every year. And basically you can just see the downward trend on all of those lakes, except Elmore, which seems to be about stable. But all the rest of them, you're losing ice earlier in the year. So we know from all the science on climate change that Vermont is going to be and is experiencing warmer and wetter seasons, shorter winters, and that precipitation is going to be and is coming in shorter, denser time periods. So like we're forecasted for tonight, we're going to get 12 inches of snow instead of 2 inches over 6 days, and more dramatic summer storms. So we can project, and we see the evidence of some species benefiting from this, and some species that are potentially losers in this situation. So we see species moving north, like cardinals, titmouse, red-bellied woodpecker, black vulture. Probably a lot of you are familiar that we had our first nesting black vulture in the state last year, right basically in downtown Burlington. I think they were in Colchester. Short distance migrants also, interestingly, if you think about, a lot of people are reporting bluebirds, robins, things like that, sticking around for long portions of the winter, coming back earlier in spring. They're not moving very far, so they can adapt to these changes. When it gets warm earlier in the spring, they can just move right north. In contrast, long distance migrants are responding to photoperiod, to sunlight. If they're down in Patagonia, they don't know what the weather is up here. So they may be able to adapt less well to changing situations. So in our category of potential losers, we know montane areas, high elevation areas, are warming faster than lower elevation areas. In addition, they're just on these kind of little habitat islands, which are slowly moving up in elevation towards the mountaintops. So species like black-polled warbler, white-throated sparrow, Bicknell's thrush are all imperiled by that. We have also boreal species, so boreal chickadee, gray jay, spruce grouse, and others, which find fairly limited habitat here. And we're right at the southern edge of the range. We're expecting over time that range is going to continue to move north, and eventually out of the state. And there's a few things we can do here and there to slow that down or to keep things where we can, but by and large, that's going to be an overriding force. Wetland species, especially coastal wetlands, are expected to be affected significantly by habitat loss. So in New Hampshire and some of the other East Coast states, salt marsh sparrow is a really big issue, with a significantly declined rare species, and squeezed right up against coastal homes. So they're in a tough place there. We have a little less of that impact here in Vermont, but certainly changes to the water level of Lake Champlain have vast changes to all the wetland complexes there. So it's something to keep in mind. Like I mentioned, long distance migrants, not able to adapt as well to those spring conditions to take advantage of that. And then this last question about changes in the phenology. So if you're a bird that's flying north from South America, you're coming up here to exploit these insects in the breeding season, but it's warmed up 2 weeks before, the insects have already come out, you're out of sync with that pulse of insects that's available, has been available. So we don't really know what the realm of impacts is going to look like, and we're trying to sort all this out. But these are some of the kind of potential mechanisms that we're all thinking about. And so we've talked about a little bit about habitat fragmentation of habitat in Vermont, climate change. Just to note, there's also a host of other things going on at the same time. We know that the highest number of birds that are confirmed to be killed, not just habitat loss, but dead birds caused by humans, are due to domestic cats. So pesticides, windows and lights, towers and turbines, cars, add all of those up, domestic cats kill more than that. But all of those things are important. So we want to think about both the habitat threats and the non-habitat threats to our birds and all of our wildlife in the state.
Doug, I have a couple questions if we before we go.
Yeah, jump in, Tom.
So I'm going to go scroll back, and the first question was from one of our participants who said, I've been surveying neighbors on bald eagle sightings in Burlington. How many nests do we have in the Burlington area itself?
I'm not aware of any in the really local to Burlington area. There was one on, what's that first island off the causeway there? I can't remember the name of it, but there has been one there in the past.
Long Island.
Thank you. Yes. There are quite a few in that general region of the lake. So certainly a bunch in the islands and a bunch down towards kind of Shelburne and south of Burlington. And a significant portion of the eagle population, as you all probably know, is made up of non-breeding juveniles or subadults. So it takes them 5 years or more before they start to breed. And probably a lot of those birds are hanging out near Lake Champlain as they kind of look for territories, get older, you know, bulk up a little bit during the growing season.
The second question, Doug, is relates to the terns of which you spoke. The question is, what can be done to help common terns?
Yeah, it's really a tough one. You know, I give a lot of credit to Mark Labar with Audubon Vermont because he's out there every year. You know, he's experimented with a wire grid to prevent access for the gulls, which are competitive nesters on the islands. We've done ant baits because ants can kill chicks. We've done shelters that the chicks can run under in case there's a predator that comes. We've tried motion sensitive lights to prevent owls from coming in at night. So it's really, with so few nesting locations and so discrete an area. I mean, these islands, if you've been there, it's like 400 square feet. It's the size of, you know, someone's bedroom, if they're lucky. And all it takes is one owl that's nesting nearby. And if that bird's coming back and back and back, then they're in trouble. So right now we don't have any brilliant creative ideas. I mean, the one thing that would help would be to have more staff people out there to prevent predation events. But then again, that level of disturbance might, you know, perturb the birds, and we don't have the funds or the inclination to have someone just sit around on a rock all day. So it's a tricky spot that everybody up and down the East Coast and the Great Lakes is in, where we're trying to decide which of these tern colonies are sustainable and which we can just limp along as long as we can.
We have a germane term question that just popped up, and somebody asked, well, what about Caspian terns? They seem to be expanding their populations rapidly. Isn't that relatively recent?
Yeah, I believe that's right. And actually, I don't know that much about Caspian terns. It's on my to-do list to read about. Some of the terns are doing better than others. You know, we have black terns nesting in Missisquoi that are hanging on fairly well, but they're using that really marshy habitat. I don't know enough about Caspian terns right now to say how they compare to the common terns.
The last question on this part of your talk is from one of our board members who asks, is climate change and our increased fragmentation resulting in any significant changes in the distribution of boreal montane species without a decline in their total population? In other words, Are there any positive news for boreal montane species?
Not that I can think of. VCE, the Center for Eco Studies, runs the Mountain Birdwatch program, which is an amazing community science effort that I encourage people to look up if you're not familiar with it. They're always looking for volunteers. And they have some really amazing data on what both the habitats are doing and what the birds are doing relative to climate change over time. In some cases, we're actually seeing softwoods start to move down a little bit. There's been a little rebound of red spruce, particularly, which was, we think, damaged by acid rain in the past. So there's some kind of complex things where it may be rebounding. But the short answer is it's hard to kind of look out into the future and imagine that this is going to work well for those species. It may last a lot longer than some of the headlines portray because it's going to take a long time for the tree species to move. But the places where we have true boreal habitat instead of montane, we're talking about the Milhegan Basin and basically the Victory Basin in Northeast Kingdom. And as the names imply, you're looking at these lowland basins that just hold cold water, cold air drainage. So they get these softwood species. They'll be climate refugia over time, but the projection is for those islands to kind of get smaller and smaller as the more marginal habitat creeps in. The hardwoods will creep in around them.
That's it for now. So onward we go.
Great. So scaling down to Vermont from some of those larger studies around 3 billion birds lost. This is from our breeding bird atlas. So this data is about 10 years old, but basically these trends are pretty consistent. You can see in the dark blue, we have gains. So we want to see dark blue. In the light blue, we have losses. So we don't want to see that. And then in the very lightest color, we have no change. So we'd really like to see as much dark blue and the lightest, blue-gray as possible. And the places where we do see that are basically developed habitats near the center. You can see that column of developed is actually increasing. Forested habitats, birds that nest in forested habitats, and wetlands. So developed forests and wetlands. This kind of makes sense based on what we know in the state, agricultural reversion. We have forests growing back overall. We have an increase in developed habitat, and our wetlands have done pretty well in the last few decades due to, intentional conservation efforts. At the same time, we can see the Vermont trends are similar to those national ones. So we have grassland on the far left, very little gain, a lot of losses. We have boreal closer, just left of center, little gains, a lot of losses. And then aerial insectivores closer to the far right, also a lot of declines. Aerial insectivores is an interesting category. And the idea is they're birds that catch insects out of the air. So things like swifts and swallows. And we'll talk more about some specifics here, but suffice it to say, they're not all the same, but they do share the similarity that they hunt for prey out of the air. And there seems to be potentially something meaningful about that. So this is, again, based on the breeding bird atlas data. We can see species that are increasing. This is by percentage. So there's some bias towards this data, but it's one way to look at it. So we see huge gains in osprey. Osprey would be another species I could have included in the first section, where we've had a lot of investment in it historically, a lot of partnerships. They've done really, really well. So increases in osprey, goose, Carolina wren, tufted titmouse, bald eagle, house finch. So, we're seeing feeder birds, we're seeing kind of human associated birds, some of the wetland, the raptors, ospreys, and eagles that have had intentional conservation efforts, wild turkey, turkey, vulture, common loon. So, probably nothing terribly surprising on this list. And then we're hopping over to percent loss. So common nighthawk, that's one of our aerial insectivores. A couple down from that, we have whipperweel, another one of the aerial insectivores. We have purple martins down farther, and cliff swallows, bank swallows, olive-sided flycatchers. So all of those would be the aerial insectivore group. Philadelphia vireo is probably on there as kind of a statistical fluke because there's so few of them. Any small change shows up as a large percentage. But then we also have boreal chickadee on there. So boreal habitats, we have vesper sparrow and eastern meadowlark in grasslands. So we're seeing these consistent trends around, aerial insectivores, grasslands, and also shrublands, brown thrasher on there. So let's hop towards a few specific examples of projects that have increased over the last few years. We have eastern meadowlark all the way on the left. As I mentioned, meadowlarks will be added to the state endangered species list in the next couple of weeks officially. They have experienced what is estimated a 95% population decline over the last few decades. We believe there's probably maybe 100 pairs, probably fewer in the entire state of Vermont right now. So this is just an eBird map. This is not necessarily breeding pairs, but it gives you a rough idea of a relative distribution. And the Vermont Center for Eco Studies did coordinate a volunteer survey, and we're hoping to continue to partner with them on that and increase our efforts around monitoring for eastern meadowlarks, and even do some landowner outreach, things like best management practices. How can you try to get a cut of hay, 2 cuts of hay off of the field and still allow time for these birds to successfully nest. We also have existing birds that are on our endangered species list that use grasslands. We have upland sandpiper in the center and grasshopper sparrow on the right. I included these partially because of your geographic area, that we have basically our best concentration of uplands and grasshopper sparrows occurring up in the Franklin County Airport pretty regularly, and then occasionally at other locations in the Champlain Valley for the grasshopper sparrows or at other airports. So large grassy areas, and the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department does work with VTRANs and the airport managers to the extent they can to accommodate the breeding cycle of these birds. But as you might imagine, airports are highly regulated facilities for public safety, so there's always some back and forth whenever that happens. In addition, we have recently, in the last number of years, been regulating development within grasslands. So this is work that the department does not receive a lot of publicity for, but goes on behind the scenes, that we have a role in regulatory proceedings of Act 250, which is the land use development law for subdivisions, large developments, and also Section 248, which regulates energy development. So in this case, we're seeing a larger number of solar developments proposed for grassland fields. So increasingly, we're trying to work with developers to avoid or minimize or mitigate their impacts to nesting grassland birds when that does happen. Another set of projects that we've been involved in, with a key partner being in Audubon, Vermont again, is shrubland habitat work, so particularly for golden-winged warblers. So some of you may know the Prague Park area, as well as some work in Charlotte they've done. We've had them looking at some areas in the southern Champlain Valley where we have golden-winged warblers. And this is all basically shrubland management work. It works really well. If any of you are landowners and are interested, especially in the Champlain Valley, there's so many invasive species, particularly honeysuckle, that get established in these shrublands, that the way to do it is to go in and knock out a bunch of the invasive species, and that leaves nice big holes to get this kind of heterogeneity, this diversity in the shrubland. In the case of golden wings, you'd want to be doing it where those birds already exist, which is a pretty limited number of areas. but just that work generally can be beneficial to a range of shrubland birds. So that's something that we've been working on with Audubon, as I mentioned. We have, if you don't know about these, you got to look these up. These are a product of the eBird data. So kudos to anyone who logs their birding lists on eBird. So this is the Goldenwing warbler throughout the year, based on eBird observations alone. So you can see that they're just barely coming up into Vermont, really just into the Champlain Valley. Let me see if I can stop it just in time. So here we're in June, July. Oh, I missed it. Late June. Oh gosh, okay. I tried too hard. So this is mostly to show off these really neat data sets that eBird has compiled, but also to say that the Goldenwing warbler is not a listed species in Vermont, but it is considered a species of high conservation concern. So it is a species that we are interested in working on and partnering on. We have some collaborations with states up and down the East Coast. And one of the interesting things that both this eBird data and some more specific geotagging tracking data, which I can talk about a little bit more later, is that they're basically two distinct populations from the Goldenwing warblers that are leaving Central and South America. You can see a bunch of them go up to the Great Lakes area. Others go down through the Appalachians. The Appalachian birds tend to go towards Venezuela and South America for wintering, which tends to experience more habitat loss. And so those birds are declining more steeply than birds in the Great Lakes area, which tend to winter in Central America. So now we're making the connection to the fact that a lot of our birds are either short distance or long distance migrants and have a whole bunch of other factors affecting their populations that may not have anything to do with what's happening in Vermont.
Doug, can I break in with a quick question? We had somebody, when you were talking about, birds that are breeding here, here's the comment. With the first documented nesting of dickcissel at Lagoon Road this past summer, what might be the next, quote, new, unquote, breeding bird in Vermont?
Oh, I don't have a good answer for that one. That would be a good one for people to put their suspicions in the chat and see if we can get a consensus answer. But we could look at the eBird observations in Massachusetts and see what's occurring down there that we haven't picked up yet. Certainly black vulture was a big surprise to me, although they are expanding notably. So we'll be seeing more of them soon for sure.
Thank you.
So Eastern whipperweel, one of those aerial insectivores I mentioned, this is state listed now. This was a relatively recent addition. Again, we have a map here of eBird observations, so not known nests, but tells you something about relative frequency. And we can see, if we forget about that big clump over in New Hampshire, because that's out of our jurisdiction, west of Rutland, in that kind of Rutland, northern Rutland County area, there's a big chunk of observations there. And we've been contracting with the Vermont Center of Eco Studies for almost the last 10 years to do surveys of whippoorwills throughout the state, both regular long-term surveys to try to observe trends and specific surveys geographically in different parts of the state to try to narrow down where the birds are. And what we're finding is that's really the hotspot, is that kind of Rutland County area, West Haven. We don't know why. There's a huge amount of research that's been done on birds. We know a lot, and there's a lot more that we don't know. So there's some speculation that it's related to habitats which are regrowing. They like these kind of early successional, somewhat disturbed habitats. But maybe it's not that at all. Maybe it has to do with winter and ground issues. Maybe it has to do with pesticides and insect availability. Maybe it has to do with a combination of all of those things. But because Eastern whippoorwills are now on the state endangered species list, again, the department is able to act in development review settings. So we've had a couple of those where folks are planning projects that would impact where we have known whippoorwill occurrences. And since there's so few known whippoorwill breeding occurrences now, we do work with those developers to try to avoid or minimize those impacts. Then we have, on a little bit different gear, we have what's called modus. So modus is Latin for movement. And what it is now a global network of receiving towers. They're basically radio receivers. This is the entire size of the tower. It's pretty small, 20, 30 feet, couple of antennae. And these towers, the idea is to put up a sufficient grid of them. They can detect a radio transmitter for 10 to 15 kilometers in any direction if they're in a good vantage point. So the idea is to put out this grid of them, and these dots are showing you where ones already exist. That way, any bird, or even something as small as a monarch butterfly, which have been tagged with these radio tags, any of them that pass within its receiving zone will get logged as being present at that location at that time. So once this network is built out a little bit more, we'll have really sensitive data for, anything that gets banded north of us and is going to fly south through Vermont. The idea is to have what's called a fence line. So kind of stations on a latitudinal line. That way they have to cross through the receiving area and we'll know where they're moving. And then again, in the spring, they'll move to the north and we'll catch them again. So this network's just been developed over the last few years. We have currently 6 stations in Vermont. I think 2 of them are at Shelburne Farms with some of the grassland bird work that's been going on there. There's one that just went up at Missisquoi. There's one that we've placed at the Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area. And then I think there's 1 or 2 down in the Buckner Preserve, which is a project that Audubon and TNC have been working on. So super cool work. Will have impacts for any and all the species that people want to work on. Even insects, like I mentioned, you could probably stick the tags on some of the larger migratory dragonflies. So potentially cool applications. And we're hoping within the next year, we have currently grant funding to put up a number of more stations in Vermont to basically complete the first sections of this fence line through our state and through the rest of New England. And this is a partnership project that we're working now with states down all the way to Alabama and basically anybody in between to try to get these towers put up. So really exciting. And like I mentioned with the Goldenwing warbler work, that map of them moving from eBird, that's interesting, but it's pretty, it's pretty coarse data. So if we can know exactly where one bird goes and connect the dots, that gives us another level of data to work with. We talked about a lot of birds that have been declining, and we have this chart that I showed you earlier in the upper left of this slide. A lot of different species based on habitats that are declining, but we do have that one group, that waterfowl group, that increased substantially. So what was going on there? And the news is not all bad. The waterfowl, we've put a lot of investment in. I included what's called a duck stamp, migratory bird hunting and conservation stamp. So these are required for anyone that is going to be hunting migratory waterfowl. It goes on their hunting license. As many of you probably know, you can buy one whether you hunt or not. They're $25 a year. And the funding goes towards wetland conservation and restoration. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife in Vermont and many of our similar state agencies around the country are often the recipients of these funds. In this case, they get managed by Ducks Unlimited, and then we basically apply them. And so that's helped us acquire some of the most significant wetlands in the state. So this is just a little screenshot of some of the properties that the Fish and Wildlife Department owns in the Chittenden County area. So we have Intervale WMA, which just got some new parcels added to it. A lot of people don't even know that's a Fish and Wildlife parcel, but down in the interval, all that wetlands, that's owned by the Fish and Wildlife Department, Half Moon Cove WMA. Farther north is Mallett's Creek, and then the Moyle River, and then Sandbar, which was actually the department's first WMA. So many hundreds of acres of wetland habitat getting conserved there. The Fish and Wildlife Department happens to be the mechanism for that to happen, and we're happy for that to happen. But this mechanism for the duck stamp and for the wildlife refuge system, funded by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through a separate mechanism, and the intentional efforts to preserve waterfowl have really paid off, and we've seen those huge successes. And similarly, we've seen the successes that I mentioned with eagles and falcons and loons. So I guess the moral that I take away from this is, we can really have success when we invest in these things. So a couple recommendations, things for folks to do. This figure on the left is coming out of Cornell and the 3 billion birds lost. So these are all great things to do, starting at the top, making windows safer. So basically putting up stickies or netting or something like that, moving your feeders farther away, moving plants farther away, so we're not getting window strikes. Changes in lighting, especially in cities. Keeping cats indoors, like I mentioned, cats are the #1 mortality factor for birds. Using native plants. This is big in Vermont. I mean, not just in people's front lawns, but we have people that have many dozens or hundreds of acres. So we can talk about real habitat management, or we can talk about planting a bush in the front lawn, and that's all good. Native plants support more insects, and birds need insects to breed. So it's really that simple. Avoiding pesticides. We know pesticides can have a range of impacts, both on insects and directly on birds. Shade-grown coffee can be a big one for our long-distance neotropical migrants. Most coffee is grown out in the open, which means the native habitat has been pretty well destroyed and converted. Shade-grown coffee, they maintain some layers of native habitat, and actually many of our neotropical migrants, like Canada warbler, many of the warblers, will nest happily in shade-grown coffee plantations. And there's some good websites now. If you look for bird-friendly coffee, there's a certification system now, and you can actually find it around, which is great. Reducing plastic particulates, we know now have increasing impacts kind of throughout the global food webs. Supporting citizen science efforts, or community science efforts now, as many of us are calling it. Like I mentioned, anything with eBird, Mountain Bird Watch, programs with VCE, Audubon, with the state, we're collecting all kinds of data, and we really couldn't do it without everyone helping. And then the last thing I'll say is birds can't vote, but you can. So advocating for, appropriate policy solutions where we can is a super important thing to do. And the shameless commerce division, as Car Talk likes to say, if you'd like to support, the Fish and Wildlife Department, we have a program called the Habitat Stamp, which was created a few years ago. And the intention was the Fish and Wildlife Department is funded primarily based on hunting and fishing dollars in one way or another, and tax revenue. And the Habitat Stamp provides a way for people who are not hunters or anglers, or who want to add money for the conservation and management of habitat in the state, to support the department's work. So that's both used to fund some standing positions. One of them is doing private lands technical assistance, so outreach. So we have a staff member who will just show up on your property and talk to you about how to manage it for wildlife. And sometimes it goes to specific acquisition projects, so wetlands or other areas that we're interested in. There's also the Non-Game Wildlife Fund, which has been in existence for a long time and supports an array of projects that are non-game work for the department. And then a whole bunch of other organizations I threw on here because there's too many to name, but there's lots of good people in Vermont doing really good work.
Doug, we have a couple of questions. And before I give you the questions, I also would like to thank our participants, but also remind them that we would like to solicit a small donation, if possible, $2, $3, $5, if you would consider helping us out. We have recently increased our Zoom license so that we can host more people. You can find that donation button on our website, greenmountainaudubon.org. Also, Jeff Hulstrung, our president, has put into the chat the link for the habitat stamp, and that would be greatly appreciated. The question that came in is from a participant who said, I've been observing a population of eastern meadowlarks in our field over several years. Who, if anyone, would like to record this site and offer advice to help them prosper?
Cool, that's great. You're welcome to email me. My contact information was on the top there. It's just my name, Doug, with a period. So Doug.Morin, M-O-R-I-N, at vermont.gov. And or the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, Kevin Tolan, T-O-L-A-N. He's the one that organized the meadowlark blitz this last year. So we'd love to get that data. It may be a pair that we know about, or it may not be, maybe something new. So we'd love to get that. Thank you.
One last question that I see is, does the state of Vermont have a duck stamp too? And where does that money go, if so?
The state of Vermont does not. The duck stamp program is strictly federal. So all that money goes to the federal government, and then it gets brought back down to the states for us to use here. So that's kind of why we created the habitat stamp as a separate type of program to help support us if folks would like to.
That's fabulous. For those of us who have enjoyed this presentation tonight, we have a big one next week, February 10th. Scott Weidensaul, the author of A World on the Wing, and I am halfway through the book and have learned a lot. A Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds. It's a different start time. It's starting at 7 o'clock, and you do need to register through Audubon Vermont, but there's a link on our website. Then on February 24th, Mav Kim, who is doing a 4-program series this year, is doing a program on Thursday the 24th on bird nests. All of that is under our event tab on greenmountainaudubon.org. Well, Doug, I've learned quite a bit. I thank you this evening. It's been a great presentation. It's great to hear what's going on from the perspective of the Fish and Wildlife Department. So thank you very much. Thank you to all who attended tonight, and we wish you a good evening. Stay warm, stay safe, have some coffee, have some tea. Good night.
Tom, can I just add one thing? I'd like to again thank you, Doug, for an informative presentation. And for our attendees, thanks for joining us this evening, as Tom said. I encourage you to consider purchasing a habitat stamp from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife. This enables conservationists and bird lovers to have a seat at the table as the Agency of Natural Resources develops plans for Vermont wildlife management areas and other state lands. I pasted the link in the chat, which will disappear when we end the meeting. So I encourage you to click on the link now to get more information on the habitat stamp. I also pasted the link, Tom mentioned a couple upcoming events, to our events page. So hope to see you at a future program. Thanks again.
And Doug, thanks you again. And we would love to have you back next year. So put your little thinking cap on and let's see if you can update us about something else, and we will be the beneficiaries. Again, thank you, everyone. We wish you a safe evening. Drive safely. Good evening.
Thanks, everyone.